Hi, my name is Dr. Graham Simpson. I'm a physician. My specialties are internal medicine, emergency medicine, and anti-aging medicine. And I'm delighted to be here on Voices of the Future. And I've really enjoyed the meeting with my good friend Tariq. And welcome to the program.
What an honor and privilege this morning. We have Dr. Graham Simpson, who has flown down from Vegas, and he popped in to see me in our office. And a genuine privilege and pleasure to have him here. Graham is a physician, he's a doctor, he's been doing all sorts of things. But today we're going to be talking about democratizing healthcare. And he is going to be our voice for the future on this series. Graham, welcome. Good to see you.
Nice to see you again.
I know it was pre-COVID when we last met, and so much has happened.
Yeah, I left Dubai about nearly 4 years ago, so it's my first time back. It's great to see you again.
You know, you made a great mark on me when you spoke about democratizing healthcare, and some of the basics that you came up with were just so sensible and logical. So can you just share with us what democratizing healthcare means to you and how we can get towards that?
Yeah, I think, obviously I've been a practicing physician for 40 plus years. So initially in emergency medicine and then internal medicine. And I think that having seen this over the passing years, obviously currently I'm in the United States, and the US, as you might know, they're number 35 in terms of the healthcare index. So it doesn't mean just because you're throwing lots of money that you're actually going to have better healthcare. The US outspends any other country by sometimes a factor of 5, and we're way, way down on the list. So I've been very interested to try and, discover the real root causes of what, we die of in the 21st century. And it turns out that insulin resistance, which is really what makes people fat and diabetic, and currently in the US, 54% are either diabetic or pre-diabetic. Over 70% of Americans are overweight, and many, many of them are obese. I was just recently in Saudi Arabia, and it's the same, really the same statistics there. So most people don't realize that things like heart attacks, strokes, Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes, even things like erectile dysfunction and things, they're all really related to this real pandemic, which is basically insulin resistance. And 88% of Americans now are actually insulin resistance, which means they're on that trajectory for chronic disease and an early death. Most Americans, by the time they get to 60, have at least one or even two, chronic diseases. So when I look at this, and I realized over the years that, some very simple things that people can do. For instance, just, cutting out a lot of the grains and sugar, because insulin resistance is really from 3 main things. The average American now is eating 150 pounds of sugar a year, 200 pounds of grain, and 5,000 teaspoons of adulterated oils. That is really driving all chronic disease. So, it makes sense by just, for instance, we use, a well-formulated keto diet, which is a high-fat, moderate protein, low-carb diet. All this nonsense, we were misled by this guy Ansel Keys back in the 70s about cholesterol being bad. It's not cholesterol, it's sugar. 100% of people having heart attacks is from the sugar, not from cholesterol. Cholesterol is a non-entity, really. So the idea then, for instance, a well-formulated keto diet, intermittent fasting, which is incredibly important. Just this month, 3 weeks ago at the Salk Institute, there was a fascinating study looking at the molecular basis of intermittent fasting. They had 2 groups of mice. One group, they were allowed to eat whatever they liked, whenever they liked. The other group only were allowed to eat in 9 hours, so 15 hours they were basically fasting. And basically they showed that in the fasted mice, that 70% of their genes were upregulated, many of them longevity genes, plus it actually reset their whole circadian, you've got the circadian rhythm in every cell in your body. So it totally reset that as well. So I firmly believe, we were hunter-gatherers for 600,000 generations. And I mean, we probably only ate once a day or maybe once every 2 days. So, now in America and most other places, there's breakfast, lunch, and supper, the mid-morning snack, mid-afternoon, and evening snack. I mean, this is why I think we see this incredible amount of chronic disease killing us. We've done it to ourselves, essentially.
I mean, you speak about the 20th century and the 21st century. In the previous century, most of the diseases we suffered from were infectious diseases.
Absolutely.
And now we are self-inflicted cardiometabolic diseases, which are essentially avoidable.
Yeah.
What sort of mindset shift do we need to have to make these diseases and our habits towards them avoidable? Do we need to stop and ban cokes and things like that? Do we need to work? I mean, I know it's important for you and it's important for us, is that we get our brain hacked by all of these brands.
Absolutely.
And therefore it normalizes everything, but it's poison.
And sugar itself, I remember when I was here in the UAE, 4 years ago, the average person here in the UAE was having 310 sodas, like Cokes and things like that, 310 a year. Well, in one can of Coke, there's 11 teaspoons of sugar. And what happens when you do that, you literally hijack your brain and dopamine. You become an addict, just like you're a cocaine or heroin addict. So, and the problem is it starts in youth with these young kids. And so, I think if sugar was released today, it would probably be banned, but we're unfortunately too far along. So I've always believed that whoever is in the kitchen, it's not just mothers now, guys, a lot of guys do the cooking as well, but whoever is in the kitchen really holds the key to the health kingdom, in a way. So it's incredibly important for information to get out, because I don't think mothers want to see their kids be diabetic when they're 10 years old and, have liver disease and things like that. And what also was so surprising to me when I was in India, we saw where we use these little monitors, and you've probably seen them, little Abbott monitors, but I would tell a person, put it on, come back and see me. I'd have the little, goodie to measure the sugars. And the sugars we measured every 15 minutes, so 96 times in a day. So I'd say, don't change anything, keep eating your diet, just put this little thing, come back and see me in 4 days. They'd come back and I'd say, okay, look at your sugars, 300, 450, crazy high sugars. And then I'd say to them, look, I want you to keep this little monitor on, but I want you to eat off these green sheets. I had made it easy, green, orange, and red sheets. I don't know if you remember that.
I remember that you sent them to me.
So the green sheets were all the good stuff, So I said, look, do me a favor, for the next 4 days, just eat off the green sheets. And if you can, try and eat dinner a little early and breakfast late, i.e. intermittent fasting.
Indeed.
So they'd come back 4 days later. And initially I thought something was wrong with these little gizmos because their sugars were completely normal. And I thought to myself, God, you just do some good things to the body just for 4 days and your diabetes is gone. Then you've got a big dilemma. You say, look, here's what you were like, and if you're going to do this and continue this, you're going to die early. I can guarantee you, with heart disease and cancer and a lot of other bad things. Or, look, this is what you need to do to get better. So it's so simple. And, sleep is also is a great book your audience should know about it. But, Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. Most people need 7 hours of sleep, minimum. Every life form that lives on the planet that has a life of about 7 days sleeps, whether it's mice or insects or birds or fish, everything is hardwired for sleep. So sleep is critically important. Yeah. 1 day of missed sleep, you get insulin resistance.
I got this, the Samsung watch, precisely one of my core reasons was essentially that.
Yeah.
And I'm monitoring every night,
yeah.
So it makes you extremely aware.
Yeah.
So, Graham, I think you got some challenges in front of you. One of them is Big Pharma.
Oh,
and the other
yeah.
one is big food.
Yeah.
And the third one is the hospital industrial complex. And the fourth one is are the lobbyists in Senate and Congress, healthcare lobbyists.
Absolutely.
So how the hell do you handle that?
I mean, I'm hopeful that, if enough people, the keto diet, so-called, has been quite revolutionary for a lot of people. So, and it's easy to do because, you're eating more fat. So the fat is very satiating. But look, at what point, does healthcare get so expensive? It's now currently 18% of the GDP in America.
That's right.
And many of these companies, they need to start giving that kind of incentives to some of their workers and things like that. There are a lot of things. I think mothers need to be, given the right information for, so they can be there, the sort of advocates for their kids' and families' health, from husbands to kids to themselves. So, you'd think with the, and you've had a lot of experience with, smartphones. Here in the UAE, I'm sure everyone carries 3 of them with him. But the point is, you'd think that some good information, but I don't think information's quite enough. I think you need a little hand-holding initially to show people that, look, you're really not going to be giving up too much, except, all this chronic disease, you're overweight, you're fat, you're insulin resistant, you've got heart disease, you've got high blood pressure. High blood pressure comes from insulin resistance. You've got all these bad things happening, and you just have to do a little modification. You can still eat, some of the yellow and red sheets occasionally, but you want to try and eat 85% of the green sheets. And the green sheets got everything: meat, fish, eggs, salads, veggies, everything on there. Yeah. So it shouldn't be hard. But I think, I think if you try and do this all or nothing, and we've made a real mess up of telling people you have to eat 800 calories or something like that. You can't, you can't basically, you're hungry. That's why most people, they don't stay on a diet. If you're hungry all the time, you'll do it for 2 weeks and you say, well, forget about this. I'm not doing it anymore. But you're right. But things change. Look at the tobacco industry. There was a lot of naysaying about that, and not as many people smoke anymore. Alcohol also turns out to be not so good for you. We now know this from the methylation and the epigenetics that we're doing now. So I think the more proof we have for people as well, that and also then letting them try it for a few weeks and giving them the encouragement to be able to shift their, you change the mental focus. You show them, like, with these little monitors. People are not, against that if you can show them the proof of how quickly, these things can change.
Indeed. Now, moving forward to what you're doing today, fast forward into that and helping to look into the future, and that is the work that you're doing on anti-aging, chronological age versus our biological age.
Right.
And we were discussing just before we started our friend Tony Buzan, our
right.
friend, who wanted to live to 100, and he invited both of us to his 100th birthday, which was the 2nd of June, 2042. I remember it distinctly. A
great loss, an
yes.
absolute great loss, Tony.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Now, so if you want to live to 100, Graham, which I'm sure you do, what do we need to do?
I tell you, look, as I'm 72 now, so remember, age is the biggest risk factor for chronic disease and an early death. If you can actually reverse the biological age by just 7 years, which is not that hard to do, you lower your risk of all chronic disease, hypertension, strokes, heart attacks, cancer, all these things, by more than 50%. So what am I doing? I'm trying to do the right thing. So on my list, here's half a dozen points. Guys should not be more than 20% body fat. Women, not more than 28% body fat. Forget about weight, forget about BMI, it's all nonsense. You need to know how much fat is on your body. Number 2, 7 hours of sleep, minimum. Turn down the temperature, nice and dark, move all the electronic devices away from the head of the bed, etc. Number 3, a well-formulated kind of keto diet, and not eating, throughout the day. If you can eat in an 8-hour window and have your body like in the fasting state for 16, it's incredibly important because it gets rid of all your senescent cells. As we get older, I've got a lot of old age cells, and these cells are zombie cells. They're not quite alive and they're not quite dead. So you want to get rid of these things because they put out a lot of cytokines and inflammatory molecules. Number two, the intermittent fasting also increases your stem cell pool. You know, when you're born, you've got the most stem cells, and it's a steady decline. So by the time you get to 50% of your stem cells are gone. So it bumps your stem cells, and it also does, you know, this autophagy, which is getting rid of these aged cells. So intermittent fasting, very important. Couple of other things, stress management. I mean, most of the clients I see on the world is changing so fast. I also think having a spiritual focus is a great protector against lifetime stress. So, you know, whatever that spiritual focus is, I think it's hugely protective of people. And also be careful of toxins. You know, I tell people, great book, you know, Countdown by Shana Swan, men's, and it's the same in women, by the way, but men's sperm and testosterone counts have gone down by more than 54% in the last 4 decades, when this is not a good thing. We could ultimately become Homo sapiens, could become extinct. So be very careful of, you know, lotions and potions and all the stuff you spray in your house for the little insects. They kill you faster than they kill the insects. So, you know, pollution, you know, just being mindful of that, very important.
So this wonderful list that you've given us, it's all very sensible, it's very simple, but is it, I mean, what do I visibly see? Am I going to be saving a month a year?
No, you can save. We actually can measure now your pace of aging. So we can actually lower your, if I'm really good, I can lower my biological age by 6 months. If I misbehave, I can advance my, you know, biological age. So I think also I'm very bullish about these age clocks because, you know, if I gave that to you and I said, Tarek, here are half a dozen things you need to do, and they're not that hard, just try them for a thing. But then I measure you 3 months later or 6 months later, and I say, look, Tarek, you've reversed your biological age by 4 years here or 3 years or whatever. I mean, that should be an encouraging thing to you, particularly if you've got chronic disease. Look, talking to a 20-year-old, he's not thinking about his health. But you talk to a 45 or 55 or 65 or someone like myself, I'm more interested now because I realize I better start cleaning up my act.
So one of the things in terms of anti-aging, I mean, I was reading some work that 100 will be the new 60. And the idea is that there's so much data, epigenetic data, and on every single bit that we have, that we are able now to prevent, predict,
absolutely,
manage, and
absolutely.
So the data piece is one. That's why Apple's trying to get into it.
We're moving away from this reactive, crazy disease model to a much more proactive, preventive, and predictive model. Plus, you know, the futurist I like as well is Ray Kurzweil, and you know, he's suggesting in the next decade that, you know, humans' neocortex is going to be integrated with AI and machine learning, and you're going to have these self-replicating healthy cycles. So, you know, some of these people are projecting, you know, a real bump in longevity in the years ahead. So, you know,
precisely that. I mean, Ray Kurzweil, he wants to live forever, and then he actually uses the word forever. So he speaks about singularity by by 2029, and that's another conversation. But he takes about 100 pills a day of vitamins and supplements and so on. And most people say, my partner Shamish says that you know, all these pills are effectively just
expensive urine.
Absolutely. So,
no, I mean, look.
Can you demystify that, please?
In my own experience, look, I'm probably moderately, you know, I don't take 100, but I've got several very vital people. I mean, my good friend Dion Friedland, he's now 80. And I mean, he's Mr. World and Mr. Europe and Mr. USA and everything else. So, you know, 5% body fat. And he takes, and I've got other friends, you know, in their 80s and that, a lot of them are taking 30, 40 different things. I sort of divide the nutraceutical market into, core nutraceuticals, which I think everyone should, like for instance, in America, 80% of the people are deficient in magnesium and vitamin B. So there are some core vitamins I think all of us should take. Most people are also deficient in omega, EPA and DHEA. So that's another good one to take, I think. Zinc is another good one. Iodine is a good one. So, there are probably a dozen core supplements most people should take. And then if you have a particular problem in an issue, you take these more targeted nutraceuticals. There's also hormone balance, which we didn't quite mention. It's another thing that, I'm keen on to balance and optimize our hormones. And now there's a lot of interest in what we call peptides, and semaglutide, we were chatting about it, it's a tremendous way to help people lose, their 20% of their body weight. And so, there are select things, but I'm not that keen on pharmaceutical. The average senior citizen now in the United States is on 60 bloody drugs, most of which they don't need. So, I think some common sense must prevail in some of these things.
You gave a shocking statistic that, and better coming from you rather than from myself, was that an average person going to a random doctor, has a very, very low success rate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking mostly in the United States, but I think, a random person meeting a random doctor can be actually made worse 50% of the time. So, and it's mostly because, you've known this. I mean, doctors are the third leading cause of death in the United States. There's heart attacks, cancer, and doctors. So, we definitely need a major revolution in the healthcare industry. And I suppose the democratizing of healthcare to me is so simple. If we just had, half a dozen of these lessons sort of implemented in an early age by, parents, we'd have a much, much healthier world.
So there's a nice segue to get back into the democratization piece. How do we make it inexpensive? How do we make it accessible? I know you had an app that you wanted to put together that everybody shares that. What can we do to just literally make this into our lives, a part of our lives?
It's amused me when I watch something like TikTok. I mean, here's a couple little blurbs and suddenly, it goes viral and, millions of people are looking at these things. So, I suppose, how do we take this great information that we know is very real, but how do we package it into, and I'm not that person, as you know, I'm lucky to do my emails and things, but the point is, there must be a way to make it fun and entertaining and not too heavy and very informative for people, and to remind them, on an ongoing basis, because we sometimes need to be, reminded of things, but it has to come through, the smartphones and things like that. I mean, I think most of the world now has these smartphones. So for me, the real trick, and if there's anyone listening that knows how to do this, but to package, these simple sort of lifestyle, hugely important mechanisms to add, lots of healthy years to your life. Because remember, you don't only want to, have a lifespan increase. You want to have the health span, the number of years you stay vital in things. So, I think it's coming. I mean, I'm not sure what's coming after emails and some of the TikToks and things, but I do think there's going to be an ability to get this information to people globally, which is, really motivates me. I mean, that's why I get out of bed in the morning. I figure out, well, how are we going to extend this a little bit further, to people?
So again, looking forward into the future, as this series is Voices of the Future, and you are a leading healthcare voice that I love, trust, and respect. What is the message that you are giving to people out there as they look into the future? I know you've obviously mentioned that, but to synthesize that, what is that core message that you want to leave behind?
I mean, I see, I was mentioning to you my good friend Larry Dosey, who is one of my few remaining living mentors. But, I do think consciousness is at the heart of things. Just like our old medical system, this reactive disease thing was built, I suppose, about about bugs. And we've obviously all gone through this recent thing with COVID, which is, I think, an absolute nightmare, because, I don't think it's just the bugs. Louis Pasteur and Claude Bernard had this ongoing thing. It's, the soil is much more important than the seed. So consciousness for me is also, just like the old healthcare system was built around bugs and antibiotics, the new healthcare system, I think, is going to be built around consciousness, and it's an evolving kind of process. So I do think as we, expand our scope, and recognize that this, mechanistic sort of epiphenomena of the brain is not really just some chemistry going on inside your cranium, but, consciousness is really non-local. It can go across space and time and things. And I think that's the ultimate healthy, true healthy approach is this expanded consciousness, which includes, some simple lifestyle, things to get people healthy.
Just to end, one of my friends, she's in Poland, and she's going through some cancer treatment, and she said something, and I'm sure you've heard these kinds of statements from a lot of your patients. She said, until there's some kind of a major event like cancer, you never think about health. And after that, nothing else matters. You only think about health. And I think it is that seminal moment about getting that awareness and that urgency, and that's making a decision at a moment in time. And
I mean, you are, that type of thing brings, an awareness in a fast kind of a way. So,
right.
And also remember, even cancer, we knew from Otto Warburg back in the 30s when he got his Nobel Prize. I mean, cancer cells are 200 times more ravenous for sugar. So we know, if you're obese and overweight and stuck on the bad Western diet, that your chances of cancer, and obviously it happens over time, because the average age of the main point of age, when you get to 64, that's when cancer really peaks. So, most of these things and that's why I think it's hard for people to connect the dots, because, if something happens fast, like the plague, or, some COVID, if it's a reality of any sort, but anyway, if it happens quite quickly and people, shortly they die. But the problem with insulin resistance is that it's like the story where you put the frog in the pot, right?
Yes.
So if you put him in and you turn up the heat, he stays in the pot. If you throw the guy in his hot boiling water, the frog jumps out. It's the same thing. Unfortunately, we are like, these frogs where, it takes 10, 15, 20 years before you get your diabetes, and then another 10 years before your heart attack or Alzheimer's and things. So, I think people need to understand that all this chronic disease and early death and unhappiness and suffering is really coming, from this progressive, unfortunately. I mean, in 1700, the average Englishman ate 5 pounds of sugar a year. Now, in England, 150 pounds of sugar a year. This is the underlying problem, but I'm not sure why people not quite getting it, but I think it's part of this frog story. I mean, it happens slowly, that people don't notice, what's happening.
And a final question, and that is on stress management. And I know you're working with people with PTSD and stuff like that, and all of this sort of burnout and stuff like that. And if you put all of these elements together, any final sort of comments?
Yeah, I think there's a fascinating book that came out just a few months ago by a guy, Christopher Palmer, who's a psychiatrist at Harvard. And his book is called Brain Energy, but he makes a very good point that probably all mental disease is related to an imbalance of energy in the brain, which is to do with the mitochondria. Your 10% of your body weight is mitochondria, the little energy factories in all our cells. So even minor, things like anxiety or depression, even all the way up to major depression and schizophrenia and psychosis, I really believe he's onto something that, and we've done a terrible job at medicating people with mental disease because we don't understand the underlying principles.
Yep.
And sometimes, the Occam razor is sometimes the simplest solution is the right solution. So I think that, and he makes the point that all mental disease is probably metabolically driven, which is really what I'm saying about most chronic disease we see is driven by metabolic disease, in this case by, insulin resistance. And I think the mental disease is also driven by this energy which is related to your metabolic function of your mitochondria. So I think he's hit on something really important. I think we're going to hear a lot about his message in the years ahead.
You're on your 10th book now.
And
what is it about?
It's mostly writing it to make sense to myself, to be honest. But the last one's called Living Beyond 100, and it really looks at, what we need to do in terms of some of the things we need to measure and the methylation data and some of these kinds of things.
I hope we will live beyond 100. I'm talking about voices of the future. You're writing a book on that. I think there's this sort of convergence of the two. Great.
Yeah, lovely being. Thanks for inviting me, popping in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.